Greetings everybody out to sea. Little rendition of Alice in Chains, Nutshell, Rest in Peace, Lane Staley, Mike Starr. I figured that song would be fitting to preface a talk about drug treatment and the plethora of options that are available, and I want to give a rundown of what I have done, and I'll do it in a linear fashion. So might not be able to fit it all in this one video. There might have to be a couple more parts. But as far as I see it, you got a few primary options for treatment. You got your home detox. You just do it yourself. You do it at home. Whether it's your house or someone else's house, behind the dumpster, there are people who have pulled it off on their own when they're ready. You got home detox. And then you got MAT, medication assisted therapy. Buprenorphine, methadone, Vivitrol. Of course you got inpatient, and there's a plethora of those. Some have different ideologies than others. You got your outpatient. And then you have the alternative realm, which there's a whole lot of options within that. Alternative treatments I've done range from Ibogaine, whether it's the flood dose or low dose Iboga for maintenance. You got ayahuasca. I've done ayahuasca sessions that were specifically to treat my addiction issues. You got Cambo, a frog venom that you apply to fresh burns on your arm. And that's a thing that is esoteric, but I did it and some people do it. They're, using Cambo at a lot of those Ibogaine clinics down in Mexico and whatnot now. Kratom, I don't know. That one's kind of iffy, even though, I'd almost put that into MAT, People use it as a replacement, myself included, to get off of harder drugs. But then eventually you're going to kind of need some treatment to get off of the kratom. It's not so easy for a lot of people. You got therapists that work underground that will give you MDMA, LSD, psilocybin. I came into contact with a therapist who was giving me a combination of MDMA and psilocybin mushrooms. And you got those situations where parents will have their kids literally kidnapped in the middle of the night, right? A couple thugs will come into the room, take you away, and take you to like a militant boot camp style treatment center. I'm sure there's a whole lot of other options that I'm missing. I met someone who was in Mexico, and his wife had him kidnapped by it was a Mexican organization. They literally locked him in an underground dungeon to let him detox. This guy had done everything. Ironically enough, he said that was the one thing that actually got and kept him clean. So I'm sure there's stuff I'm leaving out, but you got the Scientology. They have their whole little protocol, where they put you in saunas and have you stare into people's eyes for hours on end. Leave comments if you have any other options that I'm missing here. So I've done all of these things, right? And I've got a rundown in a linear fashion of all the treatments I've done. I've done countless home detoxes. I can't even count. I've done it so many home attempts. I've done MAT. I've been on Suboxone 4 different times. I've done 3 traditional inpatients. I did a 90-day once, and then I did 2 more 30 days. And then when it comes to the alternative realm, I've done Ibogaine. I've done 2 flood doses, but I've also done a whole lot of microdosing with the raw Iboga root bark. I've done 3 ayahuasca ceremonies, and my intention doing that was to address my addiction issues and hopefully put an end to it. I've done the Cambo, the frog venom, in combination with iboga root bark. And I don't know, I'd almost put kratom into mat, even though it's not, obviously not prescribed by a doctor in a treatment setting. I kind of can compare kratom to like buprenorphine. I've done outpatient once, and it was horribly ineffective. You know, I left within a couple weeks. It was just pointless. At the time, I probably needed inpatient. I've done therapy. I've done psychedelic therapy with a legitimate therapist who was giving me the mushrooms and the MDMA. So, first time I went to treatment, I was 22 years old. This was back in 2003. I started dabbling with heroin when I was 16. The OxyContin started coming around for me around like 1999, year 2000. Those yellowish 40 milligram OxyContins, the green 80s, they were flowing like candy, man. And, you know, it didn't take long to figure out that you suck off that outer coating, wipe it on the underside of your hoodie, crush it up, snort it, shoot it, whatever you want to do with it. And, you know, that decimated a lot of my generation, you know, led us to heroin. And a lot of my peers who got in on the Oxy train, they've since deceased. You know, I'm one of the lucky ones out here. So anyways, 2003, I'd been homeless. I couldn't hold down a job. I was stealing with both hands. You know, I was always a petty thief. You know, I only took what I needed. I'd go into like Whole Foods or the PCC Natural Market. This is in Seattle. I'd steal the Putumayo World Music CDs. I'd steal food. And I always did a pretty good job of like looking clean. I was never like full-blown gutter punk junkie. You know, I'd go into Goodwill and find some decent clothes, go into the changing room, put them under the clothes I was wearing. So I always managed to look somewhat presentable, and that helps when you're shoplifting, right? And when you're kind of a sneaky fuck like me, you know, and you're not greedy. I supported my habit for over a year with petty thievery. But anyways, I was sleeping at a bus stop in Montlake by the 520 overpass, and it was in the winter, and I was grasping a little quarter piece of tar in my hand trying to sleep on this bench, and there was some weird dude wandering around, and that's when it hit me that like, I can't live like this, man. This isn't me. Like, I know all these gutter punk homeless junkies, you know, they're lancing their own abscesses on the streets, which I had to go to the UW Medical Center and have a terrible abscess cut out of the crook of my arm, Requiem for a Dream style. So I ended up in the old school detox center in South Seattle, RCKC, Recovery Centers of King County. I went once, made it 3 days, and bailed. I couldn't handle it. And at this point in time, a quarter piece of tar on the street in Seattle was $15. And I just happened to bring $15 with me to this detox center. So the whole time I knew, oh, I've got enough to get a piece. So day 3, I AMA'd, you know, made up some elaborate bullshit story about a problem with a family member. The lady, she'd seen it all. She's like, right, sure, you got an issue with a family member. You're going to be really helpful right now. I left there, overdosed on Capitol Hill, continued to run around being homeless for a couple weeks. I was back to that detox center 2 weeks after leaving. When I got there, there was this old Vietnam vet that he was still there, you know, old heroin addict. He saw me and he's like, oh man, you're back. Must be really bad out there, huh? It's like, yeah man, I'm back. You know, I'm really gonna try this time. So the second time I went, I made it. And I'd always, you know, been told that the withdrawals last for like 4-ish days and then you start coming out of the woods. I was shocked that 2 weeks in, I was still like really sick. I was far from 100%. So I learned, detox takes a little bit longer than medical journals tell you. So because I was young and I was a needle user and I hadn't been through the revolving door of treatment, RCKC, they really tried to help me. They're like, this kid has a chance, let's kind of give this guy priority. So they're like, do you want to go to treatment after this? You should, man. You need to if you want a life. I was like, okay, I'll give it a shot. I was like, what are we talking, 30 days? They're like, no, I want you to do 90 days. And I was like, 90 days, man? It's like a lifetime. They're like, is it though? Look at yourself. You've been blowing it for years, bro. Like, just go do the 90 days and reclaim your life. It's like, okay, I'll give it a shot. So I had no money. I had no insurance. And back in the day in Seattle, there was funding for helping people get into treatment and whatnot. It's called a DOTSA. I can't remember what it was an acronym for. But it's kind of ironic that back in the day, it seemed like there was more help and funding for addicts who wanted help than there are today. And it's worse now than ever, so who knows what's up with that. So I'd been at RCKC for 2 weeks, starting to feel a little bit better, and they're like, all right, we're gonna send you down to a treatment center called Thunderbird. And it was down in the hood in South Seattle. It was off like Cloverdale South and Rainier. It was like bordering Renton. It was like the end of the line for the 48 and the 7 bus stops. And this is one of the parts of Seattle where there's like very legitimate gang activity, more dangerous parts of town. White boys like me are likely to get robbed, on the spot. So this place was in the straight hood, and it was funded by the Seattle Indian Health Board. And so it wasn't all Native Americans, but it was like probably 2/3. And then, they let some white boys like me go in there. So I stayed at RCKC, the Detox, for a month. And that was abnormal. Usually they kick you out after like 2 weeks, but they had to wait to get me a bed at Thunderbird. And they knew if they sent me home after 2 weeks and I'd have to wait for 2 weeks to go to treatment, that I'd relapse. So they just kept me at the detox center. So about a month comes around, and gosh, when I was at this detox, I got there, I believe, Thanksgiving Day. So I spent Thanksgiving, Christmas, and New Year's in RCKC. And this place was pretty ghetto. I remember on New Year's Eve, one of the employees said, hey y'all, Happy New Year's. And he took a big gallon of chocolate pudding that was like in a gallon can, generic off the Cisco truck. It had a white label with black font that just straight said chocolate pudding. And he rolled it on the ground. Dude, we were so stoked. We ate that whole can of chocolate pudding. I watched a lot of people leave that detox center just like I did the first time around. I watched a lot of people leave, but I managed to stick it out this second time around. I remember the day that they put me on the bus and got me to Thunderbird. And so it was an old kind of ghetto center. I had a roommate. There was like 5 or 6 different like cabins or dorms that several men would be in. There was a separate section for the ladies. They had like a youth area. And I get down to my room, and my roommate's this like 250-pound native dude named Bear. I walk in the room, I'm like, hey, my name's Ian, how are you? And he's like, my name's Bear. And the first thing he said to me was, you know what? I don't really like white people. It's like, okay. I looked at him for a second. I was like, you know what? Neither do I, dude. And he kind of laughed. So that was a good icebreaker. We ended up being cool. But this treatment center, like, had a therapist I'd see once a week. There was like a couple in-house meetings here and there, but there weren't that many, like, they weren't really shoving classes down our throats all day. It was kind of just had you hanging out, you know. They let you just kind of dry out and try to get better. And about 45 days into the stay, they started giving you passes to leave the center and go out into the world. You know, if you have any business to take care of, if you just want to get out of the treatment center, you know, they started letting you slowly reintegrate into society. And so I was always really on guard getting on that bus out of the hood, heading back up north into Seattle. You know, I'd pick up a stranger, see if there was any free shows happening at record stores or wherever. I'd go see some music. You know, I went and saw the Wrens at Easy Street Records. Now, granted, when I got to this treatment center, not only was I completely broke, I had no possessions. Like, everything had been pawned. I had the clothes on my back, right? They hooked me up with some clothes while I was there. Most of it was way too big for me. But anyways, you know, I start making it back out into the world, and I watched a lot of people leave that treatment center. They couldn't handle the freedom pass. You know, there were people who would leave to say, oh, I'm going to check out a job or whatever. They just never come back. You know, I remember there was this one young man, he had a ring. It was like a gold ring that his granddad had given him, and he never returned. He ended up showing up like a week later. He had pawned that ring for crack. So I saw a lot of sad, tragic stuff, and I was there. I was one of the younger people, right? Most of the people in there were like old Vietnam vet junkies. You know, I heard a lot of really harsh stories, and I started to learn about the reality of how harsh addiction is. You know, one of my roomies, he'd been clean for years and years, and he had a job like driving a van around. I think he was an electrician, and he'd been sober for some time, but decided, yeah, since I'm sober, maybe I'll start selling crack, you know, make a little extra money. And he successfully sold his stones for a while, and then one day came where he'd sold it all, but he had like a half-gram stone left, right? So he was like, screw it, you know, blaze this little half-gram Beamer here. So that sent him on a run to where he didn't return the work van, went whiling out for like 4 days until the police found him in the van because it had been reported stolen, and bam, back to treatment for him. You know, he told me that when he goes to work now, he'll never have more than $10 cash on him just to get something to eat. Can't trust himself with cash. So, you know, I'd been around a lot of junkies leading up to treatment, but this was the first time I really got to observe the reality of the revolving door, that people try and try and try, and some people have success for bits of time, but relapse, and it starts all over again. So it was a good lesson in addiction. And, you know, this was the type of place that when the Cisco truck would show up, I want to say it was like on a Friday, to deliver food for the cafeteria, they would tell us, hey, if you want to get up at 5 a.m., to come help unload the truck, give you a pack of cigarettes. So it's like, oh yeah, I'm on board with that. And they were the grossest, cheapest Indian res cigarettes you could possibly get. They tasted like burning metal smells, but you know, I was down. I started working out. You know, when I got there, I was rail thin, and there was a lot of dudes straight out of prison at this treatment center. They had a little gym at one point, but someone hurt themselves and sued, so no more gym. So, you know, we're filling 5-gallon laundry detergent buckets with rocks, lifting those, burpees, push-ups, pull-ups on these bars. So I started doing this prison workout with this group of dudes, and I started to get pretty ripped, actually. You know, I went in there with long hair. I shaved my hair off. I was wearing a wife beater and these like baggy pants, and I started getting some like muscular definition. People were calling me Eminem. They're like, oh, check out his Eminem over here. He's getting ripped. My stepdad and little sisters started to come visit me. And when my stepdad first saw me, he took a double take. He's like, I didn't think that was you. I've never seen you with so much weight on. You look fantastic. So I made it. I made it, you know, and I wasn't really having... Okay, so I'll say this. The first month I was in this treatment center, when it came time to go to the cafeteria to eat, even seeing a spoon, seeing the spoon would trigger me. It would set me off. That's how powerful the heroin addiction was. Even seeing a spoon, you know, which reminds me of cooking dope, would send my mind off. Oh, we should just bounce here right now and go get some dope. And that lasted like all through the first 18 months of my sobriety. The cravings were strong and never went away. Started to dissipate a little bit, but I was really proud of myself for making it through this 90-day program. Now this ADATSA funding that funded my detox and the inpatient stay, I had no money at all, right? Not only did it fund the treatment, but it funded the first 3 months' rent of the sober living house upon leaving the treatment. When it came time to leave this place, I sat down with my counselor and she's like, all right, so we got to figure out what you're going to do. You know, it's not viable that you're going to go back to your parents' house, and you're a grown man, time to start moving forward. The options are we can find you a room in a sober living house, but there's also like one of those ghetto single room occupancy buildings in Capitol Hill and First Hill, you know, right where I was right in the heart of the evil, you know, living in a single room by myself. I knew right then, no, that's a bad idea. I'm not doing that. So it's like, all right, I'm interested into looking into the sober living options. So they told me about Oxford houses, and that's a pretty, you know, they're national. There's men's and women's Oxford houses all over the country. It's just sober living situations. It's a 501c3 nonprofit. So I got really lucky because the first one that I went and interviewed at, it was way up north in Shoreline, like 196 and 7th Northeast. I had to, my bus ride from the south end all the way up there, I had to take like 3, maybe 4 buses. It was a 3-hour bus ride. But I'd get up there, you know, one of the guys picked me up at the transit center up off Aurora. And I was expecting this to be like a pretty ghetto house, right? It's sober living, you know, halfway house. I thought it was going to be garbage. I was shocked and pleasantly surprised at how nice this house was. It was a beautiful house up in Shoreline. There was an in-ground pool in the backyard. I mean, that's rare in Seattle. So it was like 8 other dudes living there. I think total we had either 8 or 9 people living in this sober house. There was a couple shared rooms, but after you'd been there for a while, got some seniority, you know, people come and go, you get your own room. So it was mostly guys around my age. You know, it was a perfect, beautiful situation. You know, I went and met them, we hit it off, they saw that I was young, and we kind of hit it off, and they're like, yeah, man, we want you to move into this house. You know, you got about 120 days sober between the detox and the treatment. You're doing fantastic. You got a spot here. So I was super stoked. And the ADATSA covered my rent for the first few months. You know, this was back in 2003, 2004. The rent was like $330 a month. And that included, coffee and toilet paper and paper towels and a bunch of amenities around the house. I got a job at the Quiznos sub, but it was not near this house. I was taking 3 buses to get to South Queen Anne Hill to go make crispy sandwiches at a Quiznos sub. So I was literally spending round trip 4 to 5 hours a day on the bus to work like 6 to 8 hour shifts. So it definitely, kept me occupied. And I remember it was a real trip on those bus rides. I'd really reflect just looking out the window, going all through Seattle, just remembering everything that had happened. It was kind of therapeutic. And while I was still having cravings, it wasn't overwhelming, and I just wanted so badly to be sober and have a decent life. While living in that Oxford house, I met my girlfriend, who's now my wife. I got into college for the first time. I, got expelled from high school 3 times. They kept sending me to Marshall, the delinquent school akin to Dangerous Minds with Michelle Pfeiffer. So I'd given up I essentially dropped out of school by like the 7th grade, but I didn't get officially expelled until my sophomore year. So when I signed up to go to North Seattle Community College, it was the first time that I'd ever, chosen to go to school on my own account. And I start taking random classes, math, English, accounting. Turns out I really enjoyed the accounting class. I was doing great, I was getting 4.0s. I was on the dean's list. But granted, just observing my other peers, it took me a little bit longer to absorb things. Like once I got it, I got it. I'm a perfectionist and my mind is so scattered that I don't know if it's ADD or just all the damage I'd done, but I had to work a little harder to absorb stuff and get the good grades, but I did it. Now, I was also working, after the Quiznos sub, I got a better job at a different pizza joint. Then I got a really good job through some old friends at this bedding company in Seattle that I ended up working there for like 8 years, and it was a fantastic job. Okay, so I left the Oxford house after like a year, and I had 18 months total abstinence. No slips, no smoking weed, no Cali sober. I was sober, and I was doing well. And, I was still having to shake off some of my old habits and behaviors, but I was growing. By the time I'm working 30 plus hours a week at this job, I'm taking a full load of classes. I'm going to AA meetings. I have a relationship. I'm overwhelmed. I bit off more than I can chew, I think. And I start getting really powerful cravings to go relapse and do dope. I remember there was some times where it would be so powerful and so overwhelming and felt so out of my control that I would have to go retreat to a bathroom stall, sometimes at school, sometimes at work, and just cry, digging my fingernails in my head, saying, no, I'm not going to do this. I'm not going to relapse. I don't want that. I want a life. I'm trying to move forward. So even amidst all the AA and doing the steps and being in a house full of recovering people and moving forward with life, the cravings were still very, very real. And while I was in college, I eventually cracked and relapsed. So from like 2003 to 2005-ish, I was sober after the traditional treatment. After that, I spent about a year trying to get sober again, right? Like I'd chip, do enough tar to get a little strung out, and then I'd suffer for a week, detox, and, rinse and repeat, rinse and repeat, rinse and repeat. For a whole year, I was in perpetual withdrawal. It was absolutely horrific. And that's when I threw in the towel and got on Suboxone. So it was about 2005, 2006 was my first experience with Matt, where I got a physician who was prescribing me at this time they were still the little orange like hexagonal pills with a weird little cross on it, 8 milligrams. More often than not, I was taking 4 to 6 milligrams a day of buprenorphine. You know, I'd get 30 a month. I'd usually sell 5 to 10 of them. You know, I had insurance that was paying for it. So the Suboxone was effective in that it kept cravings and withdrawal at bay and I could function. And every time I've been on Suboxone, the first 3-ish months are a relief and you feel really good, but then something must happen pharmacologically where I start to get really dull and dark and depressed, and life just kind of sucks. You know, it's just kind of a baseline, you know, I'm not high, you know, I'm not sick, but I'm not well, right? And emotionally it made me unstable. And I was just kind of like going through the motions of life. And also, that first time I was on Suboxone, every month or two on a weekend, I'd skip the doses and go downtown and get some tar and crack and have a little bender. You know, I knew if I stopped taking the Suboxone, don't take it for a day, then I can go do some real drugs and then get back on the Suboxone. So, you know, I was doing that. The next treatment I did, which is in the alternative realm, was Ibogaine. 2008, I find myself at Pangea Biomedics Clinic, which it was just a house in Playa State, Tijuana. It used to be the Ibogaine Association, established by Martin Polanco, this quack of a woman named Claire Wilkins, who went through there, kind of bought the rights to the website from him. She had zero idea what she was doing. All she knew is that she had a powerful experience with Ibogaine, helped her get off methadone and coke, and she also realized how profitable it was, right? You know, a week-long stay in this Ibogaine house, taking a gram or two of Ibogaine, that's like $100-150 a gram, charging anywhere from 5 to 10 G. So this woman was a straight hustler, and not only was she somewhat passionate about working with weird esoteric drugs, but highly, highly profitable. So I was desperate, right? I was desperate. Like, I'd been through treatment, I failed at that, I'd been on Suboxone, I was starting to feel suicidal on that. You know, at one point the physician gave me Zoloft, Wellbutrin, that just made it worse. So it was from reading a Vice article, old Gideon Yago article, I learned about the Ibogaine Association, I learned about Ibogaine, and I want to say this was before I was even strung out, like in the late 90s. So I came into contact with an Ibogaine clinic and I had already had so much experience with psychedelics and felt that there was the potential for healing with them, that the whole Ibogaine function made sense. You know, a psychedelic that is like a natural antidote to opiates. So, I mean, I've got a whole video talking about the depths of my Ibogaine experience. Long story short, I was there for a week. I almost died. I'm near positive I had a stroke. I ended up with Broca's aphasia, where I couldn't talk. I knew what I wanted to say. I could see the words, but I couldn't talk. I was extremely weak. I wasn't eating. I was malnourished. And I was in and out of consciousness, having these horrific, like, dream flights. But I flew home, and I was not craving opiates. Sure, my body was very weak and very sick, but the vast majority of the withdrawals were gone, and it's like the desire for opiates had been removed. Nothing short of just removed. So when I got back, you know, I guinea pigged that, and I had a couple good strung out friends that them and their families were waiting to see what happened with me, right? Like, is Ian just gonna die? Is it gonna drive him crazy, or is it gonna work? And I came home and they saw, like, damn, you know, it worked. So I inspired a couple other friends to go do it. And they had similar success for a while anyways, right? So that was 2008-ish. You know, I became so passionate about Ibogaine that by 2010 through 2012, I actually moved to Mexico and I was working and volunteering in the clinics. And I stayed opiate free for nearly 3 years after that Ibogaine. Granted, you know, I'm taking Xanax, I'm drinking, I'm taking every psychedelic under the sun. Sometimes I'm blowing fish scale coke. I was by no means sober, but I was happy and productive and totally insane from the Ibogaine. You know, I'd tell anyone who would listen. But I sincerely wanted to help. You know, after all the hell I'd been through, I felt like I found something that, like, this is it. You know, so I really wanted to help. I was also trying to redeem myself because I felt guilty for everything I did, right? So that was between 2008, 2012, I was deeply entrenched in Ibogaine. Now I start relapsing, right? Because I'm around all these drugs, all these drug addicts in the Ibogaine world. Got too close to the fire. I come to find that the Ibogaine providers are chipping and then taking a little bit of Ibogaine. You know, oh, we can mess around with a little bit of dope and just take a little bit of Iboga and bam, all good. You know, I had one of the providers say, well, doing heroin sometimes helps me better relate to my clients, right? It's like whatever you gotta tell yourself, right? Excuse me, a little coffee here. So I, you know, was opiate free 3-ish years after the Ibogaine, but I'm doing other stuff, and I made the mistake of leaving my good job in Seattle and my girlfriend and going down to Mexico, joining the Ibogaine cult, and I saw a lot of crazy stuff, and I've got videos talking about that. So then I've got a home detox coming around 2013. I met this pot growing lady at one of the Ibogaine clinics. She had kind of a sober living house in Northern California. You know, she had her old cannabis empire. She lived in Ukiah, had some really nice properties. So I kind of hit it off with her. And I helped one of her friends through an Ibogaine treatment. And at the time, I was clean and doing okay and like helping at the clinic. So I stayed in touch with her. Got to a point where I was struggling. I was trying to detox on a mat in my mom's laundry room. And I actually made it through the worst of it. But I contacted this woman and told her, hey, I really need some help. You know, I got to get out of town. I'm trying to get better. So she's like, all right, I got an extra house down here in Ukiah. Why don't you come down here, take the train? You can stay here for a month or two, and maybe you can help me establish more of these sober living situations. I was like, okay, sounds good. So I was just by myself in this little house in Ukiah. I came to find that the shed out back had black Glad 55-gallon garbage bags full of pot, so that was nice, you know. I stayed there for like a month, you know. Upon getting back to Seattle, I was using again pretty quickly. It did not work very well. And then I did my second flood dose of Ibogaine, I want to say around 2014. So here's another alternative treatment. This wasn't at Claire's batshit clinic. This was at Sandy's place. Both Sandy and I had been treated at Claire's and were on fire for Ibogaine. You know, and this woman Claire encouraged people to kind of move down to help, especially if you had money, right? So she really milked this poor woman for everything she could. It was under the auspice of, you're going to set up another house and it's going to be for aftercare. You know, we treat people with the Ibogaine and then they stay for longer in the aftercare, kind of like a more bona fide treatment. Because we came to find that when you're just detoxing people for a week with Ibogaine, shipping them home, they're still totally raw, totally insane, back to crazy environments, they relapse, and then they die because the Ibogaine reduces your tolerance back to nothing. So, you know, it was good intentions, but the path to hell is paved with good intentions. It ended up being not financially feasible for Sandy, but she stayed down there until the end. She ended up getting back on her 30 milligram oxys. She was a chain smoker, was having lung problems. She was older. She she committed suicide at her clinic in Playa State, Tijuana. Well, she had the nurses she hired assist her. So I don't know all what happened there, but she was ready, you know, and that's really sad. Rest in peace, Sandy. But she really tried to help me. So I know that I was fed a gram of Ibogaine at her place, and it was not nearly as strong as what I took initially at Claire's. I don't know how much they gave me, but they walloped me, and I'm lucky to be alive. So, you know, I do that second flood dose of Ibogaine, and all through this, I'm microdosing with the Iboga root bark. Back to inpatient. You know, I got to a place where it's like I've done Ibogaine so many times, I'm afraid it's just gonna kill me. I kind of feel like I'm abusing it. You know, that ship has sailed. So I went back to a traditional treatment because that's what worked the first time around. This time I head out to Eastern Washington to Sundown Ranch, and 28-day program. Before I was going there, see, I'd met this young man at the Ibogaine clinic. He was from Seattle. We start hanging out in Seattle, start using together. He introduces me to this older junkie named Larry, and this guy had like older junkies dream situation. You know, he's living in the Seattle Housing Authority building on Capitol Hill off Denny. He's on the 11th floor overlooking the Space Needle. You know, he's on disability, having to pay like $30 a month for his studio room, and he's got a safe full of tar and ice, ordering 1 milligram Xanax and Klonopins from South Africa, ketamine. So I went off the rails with this guy Larry, and leading up to going to Sundown, this was around 2015, you know, I was more messed up than I'd ever been in my life. You know, even more messed up than when I was younger before I went to Thunderbird. I'm slamming tar. I'm smoking ice, which that was new to me. I was never a big speed guy, but I'm smoking ice. I'm shooting tar. I'm taking Xanax. I had that trifecta going. And some shots of ketamine here and there for good measure. So the morning, you know, my mom had to drive me to the Greyhound station. I took the Greyhound out to Yakima at like 6 in the morning. I finished all my dope that night before. I was gone. My mom picked me up, took me to the grocery store. I got like 4 donuts. You know, I had the powdered donuts. I had the chocolate filled eclairs. She got me a pack of smokes. So I had to throw away all my paraphernalia before I got on the Greyhound. For some reason, I still had all of it on me. Rigs, meth pipe, the whole deal. It's like, oh yeah, I gotta get rid of this. I'm pretty much knotted out for the whole Greyhound ride. I'm covered in powdered sugar, chocolate from the donuts. It's on my face, it's on my clothes, it's on my coat. You know, I show up there and they're like, Jesus, buddy, what happened to you? It's like, don't worry about it. We're going to get you in there. So Sundown, this was a militant 12-step inpatient program. And the counselor I had was a horrible, horrible woman. She was this mean hick that all she cared about was her horses. And as far as she was concerned, 12-step in AA, that was the ticket. That's the only thing that worked. And if you're going to question it, you're failing. She didn't like me from the get-go. You know, I was a weirdo from Seattle. She gravitated towards the kind of more rural kids. She was mean to me, and you know, I'm pretty good at throwing it back too. But I made it, you know. Now, granted, there was probably 100 people at this center, and there was an issue with people smuggling in drugs. There was a lot of Xanax flowing around the place. They took everyone aside and asked us to like rat out who had it. I straight up told him, I was like, listen, that's not my job. I'm here to get better. You guys need to do a better job searching people or something. Don't come ask me to rat on people and be a sleuth trying to figure out who's bringing stuff in. That's absurd. It's above my pay grade, bro. So I make it out of there. And pretty much detoxed. But I'm still in Seattle. And when you've been an addict in Seattle, you know, the whole city is just rot in drugs and drug culture. The only letter I got from anybody when I was in Sundown was my drug dealer Larry's friend Jamaica, his kind of girlfriend. You know, she wrote me a letter saying how proud she was, da-da-da-da. That was kind of funny. You know, the only person who took the time to write a letter was full-blown junkie. Like a week after getting out of Sundown, and of course I have every intention of staying clean for good, I end up back at Larry's flat on the 11th floor of Seattle Housing Authority building. He said, well, okay, you're doing great, so let's just not do heroin. You can just do ice and Xanax, man. I mean, that's essentially sober, right? So I blaze a bunch of ice with this guy and take like 3 1 milligram Xanax footballs. All I know is that later on in the day, I ended up back at home and I'm all amped up, ready to work, right? And it was cold out. It was in the winter time. There was ice on the grass. I decided to mow the lawn. And so I've got like the yard waste bin up in the yard, and it's kind of on the edge of this little slope. And I'm going to like shovel some grass or something into this bin. I slip on the ice and fall forward and crack my head on the edge of this can so hard that it was like bleeding profusely. I ended up with 2 huge, terrible black eyes. The neighbor across the street saw it happen, and he came out and was approaching me. And I was like, hey, what's up, man? How you doing? Everything's all good? I'm just off the chain. He literally just looked at me for a second, turned around, and went right back into his house. I ended up at my primary care physician's a few days after that with the black eyes, and, you know, she had high hopes that Sundown was going to fix me. You know, when you're leaving the ranch, they have these plaques along the road, like, this is the first day of the rest of your life. It's funny, the drummer for Hole, Patty Schemmel, she's got a great documentary and book called Hit So Hard, and she talks about going to Sundown. So that was a failed attempt. What do we come up with next? So, you know,